Jack McDaniel with Mike Johnson Associates. Let me read a list of common household chemicals to you. Air fresheners, household ammonia, antifreeze, bleach, drain cleaners, laundry detergent, mothballs, motor oil, oven cleaner, rat poison, and windshield wiper fluid. What do these chemicals have in common? Well, if you guess they're all potentially hazardous, you're right. Give yourself a pat on the back. We have almost 1 million chemicals in today's workplaces, public places, schools, and homes. And over 40 million Americans are exposed annually. We also have potential for chemical exposure in skilled care and assisted living centers. The presentation today is to make you aware of the hazardous chemicals in your workplace, how to protect yourself. Even if your job is not directly involved with handling and using the chemicals, you should be aware of what those chemicals are and what they can do. In a sense, a skilled care facility or an assisted living center is a closed community. What one person does can affect everyone else. So sit back, relax, and let's get started. The purpose of this presentation is to inform and educate you so that you are aware of the chemical hazards in your facility and you know how to protect yourself. This training includes how to understand the new system of 16-part standardized safety data sheets and labels containing specific information and pictograms. This system provides more information about the chemicals you may use or be exposed to and is easily understood. Learning how to find and use the information should be a goal for all of us. We need to learn what hazards are present in the chemicals typically found in skilled care and assisted living facilities. Everyone needs to know where and what chemicals are used and whose job it is to use them. It should be everyone's job to know whose job it is to use the chemicals and if they are being used properly. The OSHA Hazard Communication Standard requires that an employee receive proper training before they are allowed to use a chemical. The training includes hazard identification, proper handling and usage, and protective measures. Material safety data sheets inform the worker of the physical and health hazards, handling, protective measures, first aid, and emergency procedures. The material safety data sheets are being replaced by the standardized safety data sheets that serve the same function. We will discuss these in detail later. Another change to the OSHA Hazard Communication Standard requires that the chemical manufacturer use a new type of label with much of the same information provided by the standardized safety data sheets, plus warning words and statements and pictograms in a standard format. This is extremely useful. We'll discuss these new labels extensively. The OSHA regulation also requires that each facility have a written hazard communication plan. There is one in your facility. We encourage you to access it and read it when you get a chance. We're going to classify two kinds of hazards, physical and health. Physical hazards include hazards that could result in a fire, explosion, sudden release of energy, and similar hazards. Well, which of these are present in skilled care and assisted living? Well, hopefully not chemicals with direct fire explosion hazards. These are not allowed in our facilities by the Fire Protection Code. What about a sudden release of energy? Can you think of a chemical in your facility that has a chance of causing injury or damage by a sudden release of that chemical? If you identified oxygen cylinders, give yourself 2 pats on the back. Compressed gas cylinders, including oxygen bottles, have been known to cause considerable damage and injury when they are dropped on the regulator end of the cylinder. The cylinder can become an unguided missile that can easily go through a wall. That is why we need to make sure that all cylinders are secured in an upright position. We do have chemicals that present other physical hazards. This includes corrosive detergents and drain cleaners and incompatible chemicals that can release potentially harmful gases. Can you name 2 common cleaners that can produce a harmful gas if they are used together? How about bleach and ammonia? Chemical hazards can be roughly divided, chemical health hazards can be roughly divided into 2 categories. Short-term acute effects and effects from long-term exposure, sometimes referred to as chronic exposures. Long-term effects can cause some diseases. Fortunately, we have very few chemicals that we are exposed to for long periods of time on a daily basis. However, many air fresheners contain formaldehyde, and formaldehyde is a known carcinogen. Most commonly, we are subjected to the hazards of acute exposure, a large dose all at once. We could inhale, ingest, or absorb a chemical through the skin or eyes. Each route of entry will have a different effect and require different treatment. One of our goals in this presentation is to show how acute exposures can be avoided. Here are a few acute exposures for you to think about. Drain cleaners and oven cleaners can chemically burn your eyes, skin, or lungs. Ingesting laundry detergents can lead to convulsions and coma, and even death. Bleach and detergent can permanently impair your vision and cause contact dermatitis. Ammonia can irritate the respiratory tract and lead to pneumonia. Well, where are our chemicals? Well, they're cleaning supplies and solutions, detergents, bleach, and ammonia, large volumes of liquids in storage, oxygen cylinders, as we mentioned, acetone, oven cleaners, drain cleaners. Even alcohol-based hand cleanser can be potentially hazardous to your eyes. Paint and paint thinner, maintenance chemicals, chemicals like organic solvents, epoxies, lubricants, and there are probably a lot of others. This new system that OSHA will require us to implement will enable us to more easily identify all the chemicals in our workplace and know what the potential hazards of those chemicals will be. Well, we have other challenges too, don't we? Such as individuals bringing chemicals or hazardous materials into the workplace, like cleaning solutions, air fresheners, and so forth. Manufacturers' labels that can't be read or covered. Pouring hazardous materials into an unmarked container, one that is not going to be used immediately. It's important that we regulate the chemicals and the labeling in our facility. All chemicals should be vetted in a process of determining how hazardous they are and what precautions we need to take. So if family members or other individuals bring chemicals into the workplace, we need to have a policy in place that those will have to be evaluated so that their effect on everyone in the facility can be determined. Finally, incompatible chemicals stored or used together present another challenge to us. Well, where are they used? Well, everyone knows, of course, that they are used in housekeeping, laundry, dietary, maintenance, and of course they're in storage and supply. But there are also chemicals that are used in nursing. Some of the products made for wound dressings, that kind of thing. And there are probably chemicals in all other areas that we're not even aware of yet. We need to become aware of them. One of the weapons we have to avoid hazardous exposure is detection and avoidance. And for detection and avoidance in skilled care facilities, we have the alarm system of our senses, our nose and our eyes and our mouth. Many of the chemicals we deal with have strong distinctive odors. Just think of bleach and ammonia. Organic vapors from solvents also have a distinct odor. The message is, if the odor is strong and persistent, and you can smell it, your eyes are getting irritated, open a window to let in fresh air and locate the problem. Avoidance means that unless we have been specifically trained to use a chemical safely, we simply don't handle it or use it. The following guidelines summarize how to handle and use chemicals safely. It's easier than you think. First, read the safety data sheet or material safety data sheet and the label and heed the information. Later we'll show you how to read the new standardized label. If the data sheet or label warns you of eye irritation or damage, wear eye protection. This always means chemical splash-proof goggles. If the data sheet or label warns you of skin irritation or contact dermatitis, protect your skin. This usually means chemical resistance, gloves, apron, and face shield. Note, latex gloves are not chemically resistant. Make sure your personal protective equipment, your PPE, is clean, undamaged, and fits properly. If chemicals get on your PPE, clean it according to manufacturer's instructions. Handle chemical containers carefully. A dropped or jostled container can eject hazardous chemicals when you open it. If you are using more than one chemical, read the data sheets of both chemicals to find out if they're compatible. And finally, use and store your chemicals according to manufacturer's guidelines. Under the revised OSHA HAZCOM standard, material safety data sheets will be replaced by safety data sheets. All the safety data sheets, or SDSs, will have a consistent 16-section format. Your employer must ensure that the SDSs are readily accessible to you. So they'll be in a book or binder located somewhere in your work area, such as the laundry, dietary, and housekeeping closets, as well as other designated areas. These will be pointed out to you at orientation. Ask your supervisor if you're not sure where they are located. Let's go through the 16 sections quickly. Section 1 is simply identifying the chemical and the manufacturer and how to contact the manufacturer if there is an emergency. Section 2 identifies the hazards, very important, because this includes all the hazards of the chemical. Section 3 is composition and information on the ingredients of the chemical. Section 4 is very important because it's first aid measures. Section 5 is important if you're using flammable or combustible material because that contains the firefighting measures. Section 6 is what to do in case of accidental releases of the chemical. Section 7 is important because it's how to properly handle and store the chemical. Section 8 is the exposure controls and limits for exposure to that chemical, and also the recommended or required personal protective equipment. Section 9 is physical and chemical properties of the chemical. Section 10, stability and reactivity, that is what it's stable, what it reacts with, and what it's not stable with. Section 11 gives you toxicological information, which is information mostly for the long-term effects, but also the short-term effects, acute effects also. Now, there are 4 sections that are not OSHA regulated. These have to do with the impact of the chemical on the environment if you have large quantities of it and you have to dispose of it. Also, its transportation requirements and other regulatory information. And finally, Section 16 contains, among other things, the date of preparation of the last revision of the safety data sheet. Now let's get into the topic of the new labeling system. There's going to be several elements required on the label, and some elements that are going to be at the discretion of the manufacturer. So let's go through these. First, there are symbols called pictograms. There's going to be 9 symbols. There was 1 for environmental, 4 for health hazards, and 4 for physical hazards. There's signal words, and there are only 2, danger and warning. There will be hazard statements. These statements are required by OSHA to characterize specifically both the physical and the health hazards of that chemical. Precautionary statements can be added by the manufacturer to enhance the information of how to handle and use the chemical. For example, it might have storage information on it. It might have recommended personal protective equipment to be used with it. It might have other safety precautions on it. It may have fire protection measures, and it may have first aid information on it. So these will be important. Some folks have characterized them as a condensation of the information on the safety data sheet. You want to learn how to read these 4 elements of this label. Now, the 5th element on the label is product identification and manufacturer and supplier identification. All right, now let's get into the pictograms. As I mentioned, there are 9 of them. The 4 on the left are primarily health hazards. The 4 on the right are primarily physical hazards, and the one in the middle is an environmental hazard designation. So we have health hazards, physical hazards, and environmental hazards. Let's take a look at the health hazard pictograms. The one on the left, the skull and crossbones, means acute toxicity. The one on the and in a severe category. The one on the right means it can be toxic, but it's less severe. So it's a matter of degree. If you encounter a pictogram with a skull and crossbones on it, stop. Don't use it. Get with your supervisor. Take a good long look at that product. If you have to use it, then you take every precaution in that safety data sheet and on the label. Our advice is to take a long look at the chemical, and if you can, replace it with something less dangerous. On the right, acute toxicity is what you will typically see on most labels. We think you'll probably see those on detergents, drain cleaners, that type of thing. When you see that, it means follow all the precautions on the label and the safety data sheet. The pictogram on the left is a corrosive. That means it's corrosive to your skin and to your eyes. When you see this pictogram, that means eye protection and skin protection are required if you're using this chemical. That means chemical splash-proof gloves and goggles, probably a face shield and possibly an apron. On the right, the starburst on the human bust, that is a pictogram for longer-term healthcare effects. For example, for a carcinogen, a sensitizer, a chemical that targets certain organs over time, something that affects your DNA, your genome, and an aspiration hazard, that is something that could cause pneumonia. Now the physical hazards. The one on the left, the exploding bomb, you should never see in a skilled care facility, and really anywhere else for that matter. The one on the right is for flammable and combustible materials, such as cleaning solvents, organic cleaning solvents, gasoline, and that kind of thing. This type of material should be kept to an absolute minimum in your facility. And containers, open containers of the material would never be allowed. The other physical hazards, again, the one for corrosion, since it is a corrosive to skin and eyes, it's also corrosive to metal parts, that kind of thing. So it's listed as a physical hazard because of its effect on metal. The one below, the one on the bottom, gases under pressure, you will begin to see those on every oxygen cylinder. We've discussed those. The one on the right is an oxidizer. When you see that, pay strict attention to the safety data sheet or label to make sure you know what to use that chemical with and what not to use it with. An oxidizer is something that is incompatible with another chemical. Now let's talk about signal words. There are only two words: danger and warning. Warning you will see on most chemicals, at least on many of the chemicals, such as detergents, that kind of thing. Danger means pay attention. Read the safety data sheet. Read the label. You might even want to talk to your supervisor about how to use it safely. But danger means exactly that. If you misuse it, you could suffer consequences to your health. The hazard statements. Those are specific statements that appear on the label, required to be on the label, to warn you of the specific physical and health hazards. Here are some examples. Flammable liquid and vapor causes skin irritation. That, of course, would be a health hazard. The first one would be a physical hazard. May cause cancer. That would be a long-term health hazard. Pay attention to the hazard statements. They tell you explicitly what the hazards are. Precautionary statements, as I mentioned, much of that information will be on there at the discretion of the manufacturer. But there's a lot of information that the manufacturers are preparing and planning on putting on those labels. So you need to read it. Precautionary statements may tell you how to protect yourself, such as, here's some examples, like wash with soap and water, store in a well-ventilated place, wear a respiratory protection. There'll also be a label identification, like the product identifier and supplier identification and emergency phone number. Other information which will be in precautionary statements may be the physical state of the chemical, the color, some hazards not otherwise classified, and routes of exposure. In other words, is this material acutely toxic if you swallow it? If you breathe the vapors? How dangerous is it if it gets on your skin and you absorb it? How to store and dispose of it? And hazard prevention and emergency response instructions, which may include also firefighting information and first aid. Let's talk about secondary containers. Secondary labeling systems are still permitted. Now this means that if you pour chemicals from one container, the original container, into another container, and it's under your direct control, and it's empty at the end of your shift, or when it's not under your control, then no labels are required. However, if you pour chemicals from one container into a secondary container, the labeling on that secondary container has to be consistent with this revised standard. That means that it's going to have the same information on the original label. Now, there's a number of ways you can do this. One way is this. Since the shipping container, the box that the chemical came in, will now be required to have the same label on it, you can simply cut that label out and make copies of it on a Xerox machine or equivalent. Another way is to request labels from your distributor. Most distributors are going to distribute those labels at the time of delivery. Another way is to go online and download and print the label. But the important thing is that when this standard goes into effect, as of December 1st of this year, of 2013, your labels must be consistent with the new standard labels on secondary containers. Okay, to wrap this up, let's look at our label again, because this is going to be one of the most important things in the new system, and we need to be thoroughly familiar with it. First, we have symbols called pictograms, and remember, There are 9 of them, and they indicate both health and physical hazards. Signal words, there are 2 of them, danger and warning. Pay special attention if that signal word is danger. Hazard statements that tell you the specific health and physical hazards of that chemical. Precautionary statements, which can give you a lot of good information on how to safely handle that chemical, store it, what precautions to take in case of fire, and what first aid measures are applicable. And finally, the product identification and manufacturer's name can be on there, or should be on there. If you have any questions, contact us, your administrator, and most of your supervisors know how to contact us. You can request the questions through them, and we will be glad to answer any questions you have, or at least tell you where to look for the answers. Well, thank you very much, and I hope this information is useful. And please don't assume that a chemical is safe because you've used it a certain way for years and years and years. Now is the time to step back, take a close look at that chemical, and know and understand what the hazards of that chemical are. And with that, we will close. Thank you very much.